Let's take a look at the difference between working with straight needles and with circular needles. And you'll see the circular needles are joined by, I tend to call this a wire, but it is actually quite flexible. You still need to choose the size of needle that your project requires, so that's exactly the same as flat needles. And what do we use circular needles for? Well, we can use them to knit anything that requires a tube. If we join our work in the round, you can see there I've joined the stitches together, so we can use it to knit hats or gloves, socks, baby booties, cowls, for necks. The other advantage is when you work with flat needles, unless you buy extremely long ones, you are limited as to how many stitches your needle will hold. So if you're working, for example, if you're knitting an adult jumper that's going to require a lot of stitches, you can buy circular needles that have extremely long wire. So if you imagine all of that with stitches held on your work. You also, when you're working on circular needles, doesn't matter where you stop. If you need to put your knitting down, you can just push in stitches and put your knitting down. You could use needle stoppers if you want, but when you pick up your knitting, you don't have to be at the beginning or the end of a row. And also, I find if you're like me and blessed in the chest department, I find using straight needles will bang into my chest or the top of my shoulder quite a lot. So I just prefer using circular needles, whether I'm knitting in the round or whether I'm knitting rows. So which type of needles are there? If you're new to knitting, I would recommend buying the bamboo circular needles like these. They're relatively cheap. They don't cost a lot. You can buy a set of assorted sizes so that until you know what type of knitting you prefer to do, you haven't made too much of an outlay. You might find that you prefer knitting with Aran wool, or you might find that you prefer knitting with 4-ply wool. So until you have an idea of where your focus in knitting is going to be, I would recommend buying the cheaper bamboo needles. However, because they're fairly low in price, they do tend to, as you bend, I know from experience, this won't last a huge amount of time. So then the alternative are metal circular needles, which is what I use all the time. A bit more expensive, but I've had these for years, and they last a really long time. And like I said earlier, you can buy different sizes. So this would be great for knitting a hat, and this would be great for holding lots more stitches on my needles. You can also purchase interchangeable circular needles where you have the wire that screws into your needles. I have to confess that I did buy a very expensive set, and then when one of my dogs was a puppy, she ate the wire, so all I'm left now with is some rather beautiful but useless ends. So that's the different types of circular needles you can get. What other differences are there between knitting with circular needles and flat needles? Coming back to straight needles, when you work on straight needles, these are called rows. As I say, and you're knitting backwards and forwards. When you use circular needles and you've joined your work together, so you're knitting all the way round, they're not called rows, they're called rounds. So that's just something worth remembering. You're working rounds, not rows. Another benefit to knitting in the round is you only ever have to knit. Because we're always seeing the front of our work, we never have to do a knit a row and purl a row. You can just knit and knit and knit, and you get stocking stitch. So here's a pattern, here's a hat that I've knit on my circular needles, and I literally cast on all my stitches and just knit and knit and knit all the way up to the decrease. Now when you do that, you get this rolled brim. That's the nature of knitting, or rather the nature of stocking stitch. It just rolls, which is lovely on a little child's beanie. Or you can do a rib to keep that work flat. So I've done here knit a row, purl a row, knit a row, purl a row in a rib stitch, and then knit here. And you might find some patterns will tell you to use smaller size needles for the brim and then put your work onto larger size needles, and that's just to make sure the brim sits nicely on the head and you've got a nice shape to your hat. And one last thing to mention about knitting on circular needles in the round is try to use patterns that have been specifically written for circular needles. If you follow a pattern that's written to be knit flat backwards and forwards, it might tell you row 1 to knit one row of knit stitches, 1 row of purl stitches to achieve stocking stitch. Then it might give you a stitch pattern. If you do exactly that on circular needles, your work is going to be wrong because you're not working in rows, you're working in rounds. That's not to say you can't follow a pattern that's that's written for flat knitting. You just need to make an adjustment before you start the work, and I will cover that in a separate video.